Hello, English 109W. I'm here to talk about our very last rhetorical analysis journal entry. This one is called Text, and this one I think is in some ways maybe one of the most important ones in terms of collecting information and examples from your article that you can use in your rhetorical analysis report. So with this one, I would follow the same process that we've been doing in terms of highlighting and annotating your article. That helps you to collect examples, and then write up your journal using the specific examples that you found. So the very first question asks, how is the article organized? Does it use sections, headings, or subheadings? So I'm going to go back to the article that I've been working with to talk about that. So with my article, we can see there's some kind of a beginning, and then here we get to maybe what would be, the first heading. And here I might make a note. The author uses a heading to designate the first main section. And as we move through this section, we can see that after that he gives us some subheadings. So here we've got a subheading about reading. After that, we can see there's one about writing. And so he further defines labor in terms of each of these particular tasks, writing, reflecting, assessing, projecting. Another technique or organization strategy that the author uses is to give some of the data or information in bullet form. So here you can kind of see that, and I'll make a note, the author uses bulleted list to organize data from student surveys, I believe is what this is. Student surveys / feedback. Okay. And as we move through, we can see that there are other headings that go over the basic things that he intends to cover in the article. And so that helps to organize the information throughout. The next question is, what do you notice about the title? So for my article, I'm going to look at the title. And we looked at the title, I think, originally when we were talking about the author's purpose or message. Sometimes that's contained in the title. And so here, a gradeless writing course that focuses on labor and assessing. The title is not a complete sentence, so I might make a note there about that. The title is not a complete sentence. It's a phrase or a group of words that explains what the article is about. And so that way, anybody that sees the title may think, oh, that is of particular interest to me. We've got keywords labor and assessing that also make up the title, so that gives the readers more information before they begin. What kind of evidence is used? I'm going to go back to that bulleted section because I think that's where we see one type of evidence, which here we can see the author brings in one of his students whom he calls a typical student and talks about how she accounted for her labor in the class. So during the semester, her labor consisted of, and then gives us a bulleted list of that information. And so here we've got more of a sort of case study. We've got specific information and assessment from one student. Here he gives information about how the students are articulating the expectations for labor, and again he gives us a bulleted list. Later in the article, and at certain points along the way, we also get other types of evidence besides just the evidence from his students that he's collected. Here you can see that he talks about scholarship on grading and its unreliability and inconsistency, and he names several authors in this section. And uses their ideas as evidence to back his ideal writing course. Okay. And I think we also get these authors again, where he's giving us more information. I'm not sure why my highlighter is not working so well today. He gives us more information about these authors and how their studies figure into his own. Here again we have more student data. This one was a student's response to a reflection activity, and he brings in that information to the article to use as evidence for what he's proposing. And in terms of how he presents that evidence, we might also look at this second to last question: what kind of attribution is used for outside or secondary sources, since secondary sources are one of the types of evidence that he uses. So here you can see he says, "Don't get me wrong, we always have ideal texts in our heads, and Richard Haswell's discussion of prototype and exemplar categorization strategies used by writing placement readers can be instructive in designing activities." So he brings in that author's idea by naming him and naming the types of categorization that author is proposing. Other places where he's bringing in outside sources, he tends to just use them in a parenthetical citation. Here we have a list of several authors. And of course, for this particular article, the works cited page is extensive. We have all of the sources that he's used or read to construct the article in the citations page. The next question, after you look at what types of evidence are used, and I think depending on the type of article it is, what sort of academic area it's in, different kinds of evidence are appropriate. A lot of times I think in education articles, case studies, or student samples and information are a type of evidence used. Scientific articles might want numbers and data. And I think for most of these academic articles, you'll find that the authors will turn to other studies to provide evidence for different approaches that they take. The next question: what sort of figures, tables, or other visuals are used? If we look at my particular article, there don't seem to be a lot of visuals. A more scientific study might have graphs, charts, tables. I think the one bit of evidence that, or I'm sorry, the one visual or statistic that this author uses is not until the very end, where we get some statistics about the student's success with this sort of process that he's proposing. Here, in end of semester course evaluations, over 60% of my students consistently say that they love the grading contract. When asked what their attitudes were about grading before our class and after, the majority, over 96%, usually only one or two register a concern, say that they like the contract and prefer it for our class. And so sometimes you'll see this sort of data in a table or chart. Here the author just uses it within the text itself, and there really aren't a lot of other visuals associated with this particular text. Also, when you're looking at these figures, tables, visuals, talk about why they're used, how the author uses them. Does it help to build the logos or logic for the text? And then we talked already a little bit about how the author uses outside or secondary sources, what kinds of attribution. So my author used parenthetical citations, also introducing the author within the sentence. And then the last question asks you about word choice, language, and jargon. So if we go back to my article, there will be some things, some words and jargon, I think, that are particular to writing teachers. He begins talking about assessing writing, things like critical judgment. He talks about reflection, which is a common term in the field of writing, assessment also, and some of the words that he wants to bring into this discussion, he goes about defining them, such as labor. He even has the section, what is labor? And he goes through defining that particular term and what it means to the gradeless writing course that he's proposing. So some of the jargon I might point to in my article would be terminology that connects to the field of writing. Beyond this, we might look more closely at the way the author words sentences and information to connect with the reader. And so if we take a particular sentence or group of sentences, we can kind of see how that's working. Here in this paragraph, finally, as a man, the concept of labor can have gender-bending qualities that are productive for my students and for me. If my students labor to birth essays much like the labor of childbirth, then my role and the role of my students are that of midwives. So he's using some analogy here, which for maybe an article about writing that works well. You may not find analogy in some of your articles depending on what's required in that particular field. So I might highlight this, if my highlighter were working, I might highlight this section and talk about how the author is using analogy. And so that's one way we might look at the language the author uses. The way the author constructs his or her sentences, choices that they make in terms of words, can affect the audience on an emotional level, maybe even affect the writer's credibility, and might point to how they've logically constructed their arguments. So be sure to examine the language at that level we were just looking at to determine what kinds of things are going on with the way the author constructs the sentences. Okay, so for this next week, journal number 4 may take a little bit more work than some of the previous journals that we've been working with. Let me know if you have any questions. And again, I would recommend highlighting and annotating the article first and then writing up your journal so that you can include the examples.